Today we're going to be talking about one of the greatest thinkers of all time, René Descartes. We think of him mostly as a philosopher these days, but he also made massive contributions to mathematics and the natural sciences. He completely revolutionized the way we think about maths, in particular about geometry, and he made huge contributions to the way we think about knowledge and the mind and what it is to be a person. In this video, I'm going to talk you through the pretty crazy life that Descartes led, and I'm going to introduce you to what I think are the three biggest ideas he came up with. Descartes was born in 1596 in La Haye in France. This is a town that was later renamed Descartes. At 13, his mother died and he was raised by his grandmother. He attends Jesuit college in La Flèche from 1606 or 7 to 1614-15. And there he would have followed the standard Jesuit educational system, so he would have learned logic and morals and physics and metaphysics, and later on in his studies he would have been introduced to mathematics. He came from a family of lawyers, so in 1616 he takes a law degree at Poitiers, but he never practices in law. And in 1618 he moves to Breda to work as a gentleman soldier, basically as a mercenary, a soldier for hire. And he's fighting in the Netherlands on the side of Prince Maurice against the Spanish Catholics. At this time, the Netherlands, what would later be Belgium, was controlled by the Spanish, by the Catholics, and there was many battles between the Dutch Protestants and the Catholic Spanish. And this is pretty interesting because Descartes was a Catholic, a pretty devout Catholic, and yet he was fighting on the side of the Protestants against Catholics. In 1619 he joins a different army, a Catholic army of Maximilian I, the Duke of Bavaria, who was an ally of France. And in September of that year he attends the coronation of Ferdinand II, a Catholic, as Holy Roman Emperor. Now in the winter of that year, in November, he's travelling back from the coronation. He arrives at Ulm, that's a town near Munich, and it's pretty cold, and he's sheltering in what he describes as an oven. And overnight there he has what he describes as 3 dreams, and he thinks of these as kind of like divine inspiration, a message to him from God. And this completely changes the path of his life, basically. He decides to devote himself to kind of reforming all of knowledge, starting with philosophy, which he thinks of as the basis of all knowledge, all scientific and mathematical knowledge as well. So from this point onwards, he has a kind of almost nomadic lifestyle. 1623 to 25, he travels to Italy, then he lives in Paris, then in 1628, he moves to the Dutch Netherlands, so that is kind of Protestant land, and there he keeps his address secret, and he writes, "Who lives well hidden lives well." In 1629, he's working at Franeker University, so there he's working on research in physics and metaphysics. He's planning a kind of a big book explaining all of this stuff. But in 1633, he hears of the condemnation of Galileo, supposedly for heresy, so he decides to suppress his own writings. So these are works that came down to us as treatises on light and treatises on man. In 1635, he has a daughter, Francine, with his housekeeper, Helena, but Francine dies 5 years later, 1640, and Descartes seems to be pretty cut up by this. So, on the one hand, he is a kind of a total bachelor, he's fighting in the army, he's having, daughters with his housekeeper, but it doesn't seem that he was completely aloof from this. The death of his daughter seems to really have affected him at a personal and moral level. In 1637, he publishes Discourse on Method, and a couple of years later, 1640, he becomes embroiled in a whole bunch of theological controversies in the Netherlands, so Calvinist theology kind of rules there. And up to this point, he's spent a lot of his life trying to avoid these theological controversies that affected other people like Galileo, to the point where he, suppressed his own work, but he can't avoid it completely. In 1641, he publishes what is perhaps his most famous book, Meditations on First Philosophy. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. And then throughout the 1640s, he's having correspondence with a whole bunch of people, including Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was a really talented philosopher, and the correspondence between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth really helps to illustrate what Descartes was thinking, and it brings up real problems for his thought. So we get a kind of an idea of how he dealt with really good objections that came up against his philosophical system. In 1649, he's invited to the court of Queen Christina of Sweden, and he accepts. So he goes there to be a kind of a courtier and the royal tutor. Christina asks him to give her philosophy lessons, so he's tutoring her. For some reason, he's doing that at 5 a.m. in the morning, a couple of times a week, in the middle of a Swedish winter. And perhaps unsurprisingly, he catches pneumonia on the 1st of February 1650, and he dies on the 11th of February. Before we go any further, I'd just like to jump in here and say I hope you're enjoying this content. If you'd like to help me out to make more educational academic content like this, go and take a look at my Ko-Fi page and see how you can help me out. So before we talk about Descartes' big ideas, his big innovations, we have to set the scene a little bit. So Descartes as a thinker is arriving on the scene in a period of huge intellectual change against the background of medieval scholastic philosophy. Okay, what's that? Throughout the Middle Ages, the early European universities and colleges built their systems of knowledge on basically two pillars. One was Aristotle and one was Christian theology. And really what they're trying to do is understand the world by combining Aristotle's view of the world with the Christian view of the world. And they're really teaching a dialectic method that scholars would learn through dialectic and through disputes. And they were very, very highly skilled at debating one another, logical reasoning, and drawing very kind of complex distinctions to basically try and avoid any contradictions in this kind of merging of Aristotelian and Christian doctrines. Some of the big figures of scholastic philosophy, medieval philosophy, were Anselm, Abelard, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, he is the guy of the razor fame, and Thomas Aquinas. And you can see from these dates that scholastic philosophy kind of ruled for hundreds and hundreds of years. But come the 17th century, things are changing intellectually. It's the period that we often describe as the rise of science. So what's happening in these years? Well, ideas don't change overnight from a kind of a medieval to an early modern worldview, but historians of ideas usually start thinking of the rise of science with Copernicus and heliocentrism. So 1543, Copernicus writing that it's not that everything travels around the Earth, rather the Earth is going to travel around the sun. And that completely different way of thinking of the way that the universe is organized, like it's not all about us and around us, kind of sets the tone for the rest of the scientific revolution in the 17th century. So we have developments in the microscope, we have theories of magnetism and electricity, we have developments in the telescope, we have Kepler's laws of planetary motion, we have Harvey on the circulation of the blood. So this was the intellectual atmosphere into which Descartes was emerging. And then we start to see some of the contributions to science from him and his contemporaries. So we've got theory of optics from Descartes and a little bit later from Newton. We see Hooke's theory of organic cells, and then later on we've got Newton and Leibniz developing the calculus but using some ideas from Descartes. And this period of just over 100 years of really kind of important and fundamental scientific revolution is sometimes capped off with Newton's laws of motion, so 1687. The thinkers involved in these developments would have thought of themselves as natural philosophers. So we typically think of people like Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Bacon, Gassendi and Locke as philosophers, and people like Galileo and Boyle and Newton as scientists. But they wouldn't have made that distinction. They would have described themselves as natural philosophers, basically just studying the world, including us, and how it works. So that distinction between empirical science and abstract philosophy wasn't really put in place during this period. And as we're going to see, Descartes made these huge contributions to philosophy, science, mathematics, and they're all kind of in some ways at peace with one another. One way they did distinguish themselves during this period is in thinking about how knowledge is acquired. So we have this important distinction between the rationalists and the empiricists. So the rationalists would include people like Galileo, Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz, and the empiricists would include Bacon, Gassendi, Boyle, Locke and Newton. And really the question that divides the rationalists from the empiricists is, what is the primary method that we have of gaining knowledge? Is it by going out and studying the world through empirical means? That's the model for the empiricists. Or is it through a priori reflection? That's really the model for the rationalists. So empiricists were very much focused on a posteriori knowledge, that is the kind of knowledge that you have to go out there in the world and investigate things to obtain. And the rationalists were much more focused on a priori knowledge, so the kind of knowledge that you get through pure reasoning, knowledge that we typically associate with logic and mathematics. For someone like Descartes, pretty much all of our knowledge comes ultimately through a priori reasoning. Okay, let's look at Descartes' biggest contributions to thought. Now, like I've said, Descartes came up with loads of contributions to science, to philosophy and mathematics, but I'm going to focus on just 3 here because I think these are 3 that completely transform their respective disciplines, and these are the ones that we really remember Descartes for nowadays. First, analytic geometry, sometimes called Cartesian geometry. Cartesian basically means it was Descartes. Cartesian is like the Latin form of Descartes. Up to this point in mathematical history, really the 2 pillars of maths were geometry, the study of shapes and solids and, doing stuff with a ruler and a compass, and algebra, manipulating numbers basically. And they were viewed as both completely fundamental and separate areas of mathematics until Descartes came along and developed a way of thinking about geometry in numerical algebraic terms. And basically we all know this idea. So we look at space, say a flat 2D space, as being made up of coordinates, and we call these Cartesian coordinates. So we can put an axis on the space. We have the x-axis going across the page horizontally and the y-axis going up the page vertically, so we can think of any point on the plane as 2 numbers, an x and a y. And then we can describe lines and curves and shapes, kind of the objects of geometry, in numerical algebraic terms. For instance, the equation x squared plus y squared equals 4 describes a circle that's centered on the origin, where the x-axis and the y-axis meet, and it's got a radius of 4, or 2 squared. And in general, any circle in this space can be described as x minus a squared plus y minus b squared equals r squared, where a and b give the center of the circle and r is its radius. And once we can think of these geometric objects in algebraic terms, we can then use algebraic techniques to reason about the objects of geometry. So we can integrate and differentiate to find out, for instance, the area of the circle, or we could take the tangent to some point on that circle. So these ideas of integration and differentiation came after Descartes from Newton and Leibniz, but they were very much influenced by this merging of geometry and algebra due to Descartes. Second area of thought that Descartes completely revolutionized, the theory of knowledge, or epistemology. Very often when university students start a philosophy course, the very first topic they're going to study is Descartes on knowledge and scepticism. We often start with Cartesian scepticism, named after Descartes. So what's going on there? Well, Descartes has this idea when he's sheltering from the winter storm, he's sheltering in this oven, and the dream comes to him. He has to try to reform his knowledge to somehow try and make it certain. He writes, "It is some time ago now since I perceived that from my earliest years I had accepted many false opinions as being true, and that what I had since based on such insecure principles could only be most doubtful and uncertain, so that I had to undertake seriously once in my life to rid myself of all the opinions I had adopted up to then, and to begin afresh from the foundations, if I wished to establish something firm and constant in the sciences." This is a really interesting passage for a number of reasons. So for one thing, he seems to be kind of referring to his method of education, a religious Jesuit one in which you're kind of taught through authority, right? The Bible says this, and Aristotle says this, and these other people kind of interpret it in these ways, and you've got to learn that stuff too. And he's basically saying, well, all of this stuff is quite uncertain. I want to chuck all that stuff out, just get rid of it all, in order to work out what I really do know for certain, if anything. But it's also really important what he says at the end of this passage. He wants to begin afresh from the foundations to establish something firm and constant in the sciences. So he's not being a skeptic for the sake of being a skeptic, or to be difficult, or to kind of be philosophical or whatever. He wants to put science and mathematics on absolutely certain foundations so that all of the beliefs that we then derive from those fields, everything we infer from science and mathematics, can be just as clear and certain. That's the idea, anyway. So it's a kind of a two-part philosophical method for Descartes. First of all, we try to doubt as much as we can, get rid of all those potentially bad beliefs and opinions to try and find out what remains. So that first part, the skeptical phase, that's where we get a number of very famous arguments from Descartes in the Meditations, including the argument from dreams. He says, "How many times have I dreamt at night that I was in this place, dressed by the fire, although I was quite naked in my bed? I recall having often been deceived in sleep by similar illusions. I see clearly that there are no conclusive signs by means of which one can distinguish clearly between being awake and being asleep." So that's from the first meditation. And the idea is really, really simple, right? All of this could be a dream, it could be an illusion, in some way I could be being deceived. And if that's the case, then clearly I don't know that I'm talking to you guys on YouTube. But even if I am, even if none of that hypothesis is right, even if I really am in my attic talking to you, the mere thought that all of this could be a dream seems to destroy what I take to be knowledge. My beliefs would be mere beliefs, not genuinely known. This is such a powerful argument. It's one of the most powerful arguments in all of philosophy because on the one hand it is so simple, but on the other it seems to have really, really powerful and far-reaching consequences for our knowledge of the world, of science, of pretty much everything. So what does Descartes do with this? Remember, he doesn't want to be a skeptic. He wants to put knowledge on secure foundations. So how is he going to find those secure foundations if all of this could be a dream? Well, it's here that he brings in possibly the most famous phrase in all of philosophy, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Or as Descartes would have written it in the Discourse on Method, which was written in French, je pense donc je suis. So he makes a little marginal note to explain what's going on here. We cannot doubt of our existence while we doubt. And this forms the first principle of his philosophy. There is at least something of which we are completely certain, our own existence. And from there, Descartes tries to build out from one bit of certainty, he tries to establish other areas of certainty. Maybe we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a follow-up video. The third really big idea that Descartes had was a way of revolutionizing metaphysics and the way we think about the mind and ourselves. And this is the idea of dualism, substance dualism, or as it's sometimes called, Cartesian dualism. So this idea also comes from the Cogito, Descartes' I think, therefore I am. So one way to understand the Cogito is in epistemic terms. It's giving us a certain piece of knowledge. But we can also understand it in a metaphysical way, as telling us something not just about what we know, but about what we are. I am an essentially thinking being is one way of thinking about the Cogito. And if that's what it is to be me, an essentially thinking thing, then there seems to be something quite different between me, the thinking thing, and the rest of the physical, material world around me. And this is where we get the idea of dualism from. So in the Discourse, Descartes writes, I knew I was a substance whose whole essence or nature is simply to think, and which does not require any place or depend upon any material thing in order to exist. Accordingly, this I, that is, the soul by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and indeed is easier to know than the body, and would not fail to be whatever it is, even if the body did not exist. So here Descartes is teasing out what he takes to be consequences of the cogito, right? He's saying, I am this essentially thinking thing, my body and the rest of the physical world isn't essentially a thinking thing, it's probably not a thinking thing at all, so there is this metaphysical distinction between the mind and the rest of physical reality. So metaphysically speaking, this is the position of dualism. Two fundamental kinds of things in reality. The mind and the rest of physical reality. In particular, this is substance dualism. The idea that there are two fundamentally distinct substances. Now here Descartes is taking ideas from his background in scholastic philosophy. The idea is that there exist various fundamental substances and each is characterized by an essential attribute. And Descartes is saying, well, there's the mind, that is one fundamental substance, and its essential attribute is thought, thinking. That is what characterizes the mind. It doesn't make sense to say that there's something thinking unless it's a mind, and it doesn't make sense to say it's a mind unless it's at least got the capacity for thought. On the other hand, there is what he calls body, or the physical universe. And the essential attribute there isn't thought, but is what he calls extension, kind of taking up space and time. And sometimes Descartes relates this to the idea of divisibility. So if something is physical, you can kind of divide it into smaller bits. That kind of doesn't make sense for the mind. So he uses this further on to argue that there are these essential differences between mind and body. Okay, so that's a really quite powerful argument. Descartes gives a whole bunch of different arguments here. Some work better than others. Maybe we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a follow-up video. Even though most philosophers, most contemporary philosophers nowadays aren't dualists, and those that are dualists aren't substance dualists in Descartes' sense, nevertheless, Descartes' idea of substance dualism was incredibly influential. It persisted through the centuries right up into 20th century philosophical thought. So there was books in the mid-20th century like Gilbert Ryle's Concept of Mind from 1949 that were taking as their main target Descartes' theory of the mind and arguing, in Ryle's case, for a kind of behaviourism. Other people were arguing in the 50s for a kind of physicalist identity theory. The mind and the brain are just the same thing. But the mere fact that all of these philosophers, right up into the mid part of the 20th century, were taking Descartes as their main target really shows and highlights what an influential figure he was in philosophy of mind, in what it is to be a person. There is so much more we could say about Descartes' philosophy in evaluating his arguments and teasing out the consequences. I'm going to do that in some subsequent videos. If you've got any questions for me, leave me a comment below. I'm going to try to answer all of them. If you've enjoyed this content, give it a thumbs up. That really helps me out. You might want to check out this video here. Thank you so much to all my Ko-Fi supporters for making this content possible. Thank you to you for watching this far. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you back on Attic Philosophy soon.